And I think it might. Yeah. No. Well, it is 7 o'clock. I have officially hit record, so that will happen tonight. And I'm going to say a prayer and we'll get started. So with that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for another opportunity to gather together and to study your word. We pray that you be amongst us. You have in store tonight. Lord, we do pray that you would just be with and you are still recovering illnesses and other colleges. We pray that you're with tomorrow, tonight, and here in your presence.
Listen, they go Burbank. It says you're engaged.
Yes, I'm sure it would be cool.
Jane, I'm going to come you. So there we go. So just to recap, I'm going to go ahead and say this for the sake of the recording. Last week we did chapter 31, and of course I forgot to record it. We all have our mistakes, right? I kind of got into the throes of it and just missed it. But 31 was a very interesting chapter, had some really neat things in it, and I hope that you'll go back and read it if you weren't here or you haven't looked at it. The two big things I want to point out: the notion of teraphim, that's the Hebrew word that is translated as household gods. Now this word has multiple meanings, but many archaeologists are now saying that the teraphim were not just idols that they worshiped, but were actually the equivalent of a land deed. So every land had its own god, a household had its own god. That's part of the reason why Abraham sends his servant back to his family to get a wife for his son Isaac, because they serve the same God. They worship the same God. That's why Rebecca tells Jacob to go back to her family and don't marry one of these Canaanite women, these Hittite women. And so there's a notion that Laban's family, Terah's family, the whole clan worshiped God Most High. But every region had their individual regional god, and so these teraphim were used instead of paper as a land deed. So when Rachel steals the household gods, she might be stealing her dad's idols, but she's also probably stealing her dad's titles to all the property, which would explain why Laban would come running so quickly. And of course, then God thwarts Rachel's efforts to steal her dad's property whenever Jacob and Laban have their covenant, and they have the Mizpah. They set up this pillar of stones, and they say, neither of us will cross this line, because to do so means we're declaring war, and so therefore we're never going to cross this line. And so the whole point is moot, which is interesting in the midst of it, but it also solves a problem, if that's true, of we don't have Rachel serving or worshiping another god. And so that's going to play in some here, because even with that reality, we still have this struggle of, remember, Jacob hasn't officially put his faith in God yet. If you remember a couple weeks back, whenever we read as he was leaving, he says, okay, God, I've encountered you here. This is the house of God. I've seen the angels ascending and descending down the stairs, the ladder. If you bring me back here, then I'll worship you. You will be my God. You won't just be my dad's God. You won't just be my grandfather's God. You'll be my God. You remember that? That's going to play into tonight as we get into chapter 32. So after that brief recap to try and cover myself, let's hop into 32. We're going to start with well, we had read verses 1 and 2 last week, but I'll go ahead and read 1, 2. We'll go through verse 5. That's the first big paragraph. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him, and Jacob saw them. He said, "This is God's camp." So he called the place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves, and I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight." So what do you think? What do you notice? What questions does it make you ask?
Sounds like he's trying to make peace.
Sounds like he's trying to make peace, but was there an apology in any of that?
Almost like he's testing the waters. It's like, hey, he slaughters these people, I can get out of here.
There is absolutely that notion. If he kills these people, then I know to run. And maybe I've got a little bit of buffer time. But there's not an apology for, having swindled him out of his birthright and then tricking dad out of the blessing. He's simply saying, hey, I'm coming back into town. God has blessed me. I hope that there's peace. How do you think Esau's going to feel about this? You think 20 years is enough to settle the blood feud?
Maybe not.
Realistically, as he comes back, he's Esau's master, more or less, isn't he?
Yeah. So remember what Isaac said in that blessing. As Jacob is coming back, essentially, Isaac said that Esau would serve Jacob. So this is, maybe it's a declaration of peace. Maybe it's a declaration of, hey, I'm coming back. It's time for you to take your rightful place as my servant. I don't know. It probably depends on what kind of inflection you put in it, right? You read it one way and it's a nice statement. You read it a different way and maybe it's not so much. Anything else you notice, or any other thoughts or questions it makes you ask?
It says, "Give this to my master Esau." So it's not like he's saying, "Give it to my brother, give it to my master."
So there's a sense in which maybe all I can think of is, as you said that here, is, we've got our 2 new pups recently, and when they're happy to see you, they come running up, right? But when they know they're kind of in trouble, they kind of slink up and then they give you their belly, like, okay, I'm just love on me a little bit before you find out what I've done wrong, right? So maybe there's a little bit of that. I mean, you're my master. Well,
Mine just says my Lord.
my Lord, my master, probably the same. It's definitely a title of authority. Or being real honest, between brothers, it could be a snide comment too.
Could have said jerk.
You're a jerk. Any other thoughts?
It's interesting, he sees, says he, on his way, that he sees angels of God. It's like, oh, I guess I'm protected here if you see an encampment like that.
Well, and remember, he just left this encounter with Laban, and Laban said that God spoke to him and said, don't say anything good or bad. So there's a sense in which maybe this is God continuing to go with Jacob moving forward. And so that could be a good sign. It could be a sign that maybe God is saying, okay, you're finally going to deal with this. I'm going with you. Anything else you notice, or any other questions or thoughts? Let's read the next paragraph then. 6 through 8. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 companies, thinking, if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape. So maybe not so much peace, maybe it really was testing Esau's level of anger. Is he still at a 10? And apparently he's bringing 400 men with him, so maybe he's still at a 10. Maybe it's down to a 9. It could be a 9. But he hasn't forgotten. You know, we're not down to a 1 where everything's hunky-dory, are we?
I kind of wonder which camp he's going to put you in. I mean, is it his greater wife that's going to be in one camp and the Leah in the other? Just how's he going to handle this?
So he's definitely dividing things up. He's definitely trying to think. He's hedging his bets like the family has for a long time. But yeah, I'd hate to be part of the family and wonder, which camp am I getting put in? Any other thoughts or questions? All right, next paragraph, 9 through 12. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all of the steadfast love and all the faithfulness you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mother with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number.
Now he's calling on God.
Now he's calling on God. Hey, Chris, this is the first one who actually calls on God. He admits that he needs God's help. And he also admits he left with nothing. And he is actually acknowledging God's blessings. I left with nothing, and now look, I'm 2 great companies.
Apparently he has no army with him. He got his household people, but he didn't say anything about an army.
It doesn't really say anything about army or fighting men or anything like that, does it?
He's like, my servants and my staff only.
Notice he's like a lot of us, isn't he? Things have gotten kind of hairy, so now it's time to reach out to God. Anything else you notice in his prayer? He doesn't just call God the God of his fathers, does he? He says he's the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, but he talks about his steadfast love and faithfulness. He's acknowledging that God has been with him, that God has blessed him, and God has kept his end of the promise. That if you leave me and if you leave this place and you follow me, I will bring you back. How often do we stop and take stock of how much God has fulfilled his promises to us? Granted, it is 20 years later. I mean, but we can, realize that sometimes it takes time to see that,
But you said it's 20 years later. I think that is one of the hardest things is the wait, being the patient for
yeah.
anyone.
The reality that God's timing is not ours is the hardest part. Waiting for God to do what God is going to do. And sometimes, we got to realize that part of it is in order for God to fulfill his promise to you, he's also got to work on him. And in order to fulfill his promise to you all, he might be needing to work on them. And in order to fulfill the promise to you all and then your promises, maybe he needs to be working over there. And so there's a multi-facets of things going on in God's plan. You know, my dad taught me to play chess from an early age. And if you're only paying attention to one piece on the board, that's how you lose really quickly. If you're only paying attention to the king, then your opponent's probably going to dismantle you fairly fast. But God is playing the long game. God is moving all the pieces on the board, seeking the best good for us all. And it does take time.
So God must be the ultimate multitasker.
If we think multitasking is a new thing, yeah, God's got us beaten spades. Any other thoughts?
I think it's interesting you acknowledge me. I only had a walking stick.
Yep, I left home with just a stick.
Why the Irish carried shillelaghs. They were more than just a stick.
They were a little more than just sticks, though, yes. Any other thoughts? Keep going. 13 through 21. So he spent that night there, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 mulch camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he delivered into the hand of his servants. Every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me, and put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the foremost, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent the night in the camp.
Or by the time he gets to it, he may be 10 times mad.
Or at least you got buffers, right? There's walls of these animals where if you see him charging, you've got a little bit more time.
No wonder he said 400 men to help him bring him back, because extra people and stuff and.
You know, if we remember a couple of chapters back, when Abraham went to go rescue Lot, he had his 380 fighting men, right? Esau's got 400. Esau's not taking any chances. And apparently he's heard enough about what Jacob is bringing that he's thinking, if he's got this many flocks and herds, and then I'm just going to be ready.
Is there anything significant about the numbers that they list all of this?
The reality is each flock and herd, the number that they give you is more than enough by itself to sustain the family. I mean, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, that's a large herd of goats.
So imagine what his entire herd was if he could.
Yeah, if that's his gift, if that's the gift, we can at least assume it's probably a minimum of a 10th. He's probably giving a tithe. He might be giving more than that. We don't know what it is, but if he can afford to give that away, then imagine what he still has. And by the same token, to that point, realistically, if he's got that many flocks and herds, even if he had 400 fighting men, they aren't fighting because they're wrangling animals.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys in that storm that's following that group and you would think it's probably an army coming to attack. I mean,
And then thinking back to last week, whenever he left in the middle of the night in order to try and get ahead of his father-in-law Laban, that many animals, you aren't traveling fast.
Or quietly.
Or quietly, or stealthily. This is the circus coming to town with all the lights and sounds of blaring.
It makes me think of, my dad tells a story when he was a teenager. They moved the cattle from south of Mount Etna, and you know where that is.
Yep.
About 4 miles south of Mount Etna. And they moved them in through Huntington, downtown street, stayed at what later became the YMCA. And then about 8 miles north of Huntington to Clear Creek Township.
Mhm.
Now, Dad talked about how, and they didn't have this many animals, but how it was like 2 to 3 miles long of animals. Now, back then,
That was a big deal.
there were fences every place. Now you go someplace, there, everybody's harvesting grains instead of cattle.
Right.
But, you know, we're talking 10 miles of animals.
Oh, at least. I mean, this is, and the thing of it is not only is it 10 miles of animals, but remember, Jacob has said, we're going to send the goats first and give some space. And then we're going to send the sheep and give some space. And then the camels and give some space. And then the donkeys and give some space. And then the cows. And so this was probably 20 miles or more of animals.
Boy, spacing them out like that makes it look like there's more than there is.
Could be.
Prolongs the inevitable of getting to.
It's a lot of maneuver.
It's a lot. Yes, Greg.
Well, it also says that he tells each wave to say that I'm the next person coming in line, even from the first one. So it makes it seem like, from Esau's point of view, my brother's next, he's coming, he's next. And then he gets met with this herd of animals instead of his brother.
And so man, I hadn't really caught that. There's a level of deception even with that, isn't there?
I thought they just said he is behind us, but they didn't say how far.
Okay.
It seems like my research meant Jacob is right behind us. So
Mine
for
just
me,
says
he is the next wave, you know, instead of the next.
Yes, Leah.
I don't know why it's like he's trying to make himself seem bigger. Like, yeah, it'd be a big deal if they all came at once, but if you're sending a big group waiting a little bit and then sending another group waiting a little bit, that's a lot more intimidating than just coming in one big swoop.
Or it's my apologies, sorry, I'm
I'm looking at the Hebrew trying to figure out exactly what, if it lends itself that direction.
But if you notice, like, each wave is a bigger animal.
Yeah, start with the goats and get bigger with the animals.
Goats and then, the sheep and then the donkeys and cows and camels.
But it makes you wonder how long this actually was, because the smaller animals are not as easy to herd and were controlled as the bigger ones.
I hadn't really caught that, Grant, but as I look at the Hebrew, it's not really clear, but he absolutely could easily be stringing his brother along. Because you bring the first herd and you see this next herd in the distance, and they say, and my Lord is behind us, he's coming. So then you think, okay, here he is. So in some ways, he's actually playing his brother a little bit, because if they're coming to you, then you don't have to go rushing to them. And with so many sets of herds, he really is giving himself time to just, let's see how Esau handles all this.
Do you think at any time Esau thought Jacob was coming to kill him?
Oh, I'm certain. Why else would he bring 400 fighting men with him?
Well, it's also like, I mean, Esau's probably getting kind of upset, and his men's probably getting a little weary at this point, because they're constantly ready for the next fight, and then another herd of animals come in, and they're like, yeah, okay, the next.
We're going to kill him. Wait, it's a bunch of goats. Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to kill him. It's a bunch of sheep. By the time Jacob would actually get there, they're like, it's probably just more animals. We're not going to worry about it. Yes.
Jacob's by himself. They wouldn't notice, Jacob, if they're looking for another big herd of animals.
Or a group of people.
Yeah.
So we got each of these herds of animals, then we got the rest of his animals, and he's divided his household into 2 camps. Man, he is putting all kinds of hedges up, isn't he? Any other thoughts? Got something? No? Yeah.
Thing I keep going back to, if Esau doesn't have forgiveness in his heart, what do all these gifts matter? If you don't have a heart that is ready to forgive, it doesn't matter what somebody offers you, if you're that upset with them. Let's face it, Jacob treated him terribly.
Is Esau in the wrong to be angry? Let's just be honest. I mean, yeah, he made the stupid trade early on for, his birthright for some stew, but the second one, I mean, actually, he stole the blessing. Esau's perfectly within his right to be angry. And you're right, if he hasn't decided he's going to forgive his brother, I mean, the gifts might help, but there's no guarantee of that. No guarantee at all. Which is probably why Jacob's doing it the way he's doing it. Can I soften him up just enough to where maybe he won't decide to kill me? And I don't remember who said it, but it's evident apparently he doesn't have the fighting men, because if he had the fighting men, he'd probably just take his fighting men up to meet Esau, right? Match brawn against brawn, and then hope that maybe we'll just decide we're going to have peace. And so he doesn't have that option. So instead he's, can I buy your favor, brother?
That's a lot of animals to bring into my farm.
Yeah, I mean, who's to say he's even set up for that kind of livestock space and stuff?
Yes.
It also kind of goes to show how well Jacob is doing without their father's stuff. If he left with only a stick, and now he's coming back with all these gifts for his brother and all this stuff that he didn't have before.
It says 2 things. One, it says, man, God has blessed him. But 2, think about how much God had blessed Laban while Jacob was in charge of the flocks and herds. And now all of a sudden Jacob's taking all his stuff out. Maybe I do understand why Laban was a little bit agitated. I mean, this is not a minor event.
You gotta remember though, Laban also was sneaky when he moved all the female animals into a different camp.
I mean, I'm not going to deny that. The whole family's, they're a bunch of just deceivers. I mean, we're not claiming they're good people, but I am just saying God has really blessed them in 20 years' time. I mean, really blessed them.
Well, it makes you wonder what Esau had on top of this, to see if he could see a different, God's blessing.
I mean, Esau had everything that Isaac had. Isaac had everything that Abraham had. And we know Abraham was really wealthy.
Yeah, that doesn't mean he kept, I mean, just.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess.
Generational company doesn't stay as good as the first generation.
We all know those families where the kids squandered mom and dad's money. We know that happens, but in theory, you'd still think that Esau's probably got it pretty good.
One was a shepherd and one was a hunter.
This is true. Esau was the hunter, so maybe he didn't necessarily increase the wealth of the family while Jacob was gone. He got a bunch of warriors with him. He didn't manage to do that part, but
I mean, warriors and hunters kind of are on the same line of thinking, and
yeah.
shepherds are usually a little bit more reserved and peaceful.
Is this pointing towards a peaceful resolution, though? If you didn't already know the end of the story, would you think that this is going to end well?
Uncertain.
Uncertain at best, right?
A definite maybe.
Well, this section here that we're getting ready to read, this next section is one that where last week this was my other big trump. because I had not read it this way before. And I want to see if you guys catch it as well. So we're going to read the next paragraph, and that's 22 through 31. Okay? The same night he got up, he took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. So if you've spent any time in church, or you went to Sunday school as a kid, you probably heard this story, right? And the story is what? What do we call this story?
Jacob wrestling with God.
Jacob wrestling with God. On a technicality, that's right, but is that an accurate description of what's actually happened?
Didn't say so. That a man.
So first thing, remember, let's go back and set the stage. Jacob sent all these gifts to his brother Esau, right? He's taken his household and he's divided it into 2 camps. And now he has sent his wives and concubines and kids all across, and he is back to where he started, isn't he? Just him and his stick alone. Now, on the one hand, one might say, and I remember being told this, Jacob's wanting to have his moment with God, and he sent all his family across the river so that he could have his alone time with God. That's a really nice thought, but does the rest of the story paint that picture? It paints more of the picture that if Esau runs through the animals and then he gets to my camps, maybe my kids and my wives will slow him down so I can get out of Dodge, doesn't it? I mean, that's kind of the picture it paints, isn't it? He's thinking worst case scenario, I guess I came with nothing, I can leave with nothing, and we can start over. Yes, Karen.
Only to that point, it matters which side of the river Esau's on.
Esau is on the same side of the river as all his stuff.
What were his 2 wives?
Well, we know that they don't get along very well, even though they're sisters, but I'm assuming that they're probably not very happy with him anyway. Because they lost dad and they lost their family. But he doesn't seem to be asking them, and we don't get their response.
But it said that he sent all of his other stuff across the river also.
He said all his stuff.
So he was without anything.
He was alone. And once he finally gets alone, then somebody shows up.
He didn't know it was God.
He didn't know it was God at first.
And why did he ask him to bless him?
Well, I mean, so let's think about this a little bit. Let's dissect this story a little bit. If this man jumps in and he doesn't know who he is in the middle of the night, for all he knows, it could be Esau. Right? I mean, it's middle of the night, you can't see anything. He's got none of his family around, he got none of his stuff around. He hasn't seen his brother in 20 years. He doesn't know who this person is who's coming to wrestle with him, who is wrestling him. That's one reality, right? We don't know. Nothing says who it is. Second, this man is pinning him to the ground. Now, the two things we know about Jacob up to this point is, one, he's a swindler, and two, he'll run away from problems, right? I mean, am I wrong? So this man, really, if you read it, the man is the one wrestling with Jacob, not Jacob with the man, right? You almost get the picture of the older brother on top of the younger brother, sitting on his chest, holding his arms down, saying, you ain't going anywhere. And if you read it in the Hebrew, it implies that even more. It says the man was on top of him, wrestling him to the ground. You're not running, you're not going anywhere.
And his thigh gets hurt, so he can't.
And then once he finally realizes he's not going anywhere and Jacob's not giving up, the literal Hebrew is, and he punched him in the palm of his thigh. So literally he punched inside the leg and just popped his leg out of joint. I've not watched a lot of wrestling, but I'm pretty sure that's an illegal move. Braxton, is that an illegal move? Does that get you in trouble?
Yeah.
Is that considered fair fight?
No,
Does it get you disqualified?
no,
Doesn't get you disqualified, it's just not fair.
the other guy gets a point.
Oh, the other guy gets the point.
So he gets to be blessed.
So we have this guy who has pinned Jacob down all night long. And for all intents and purposes, whenever I read it that way, it implies to me, Jacob's thinking, you know, I can still get out of here and I still have my life. And God saved me for 20 years once. I guess he can always do it again, right? And so you have this man on top of him. Whenever Jacob finally decides that he's not going to get away, and then this man pops his hip out of socket, the next thing Jacob does is Jacob, which means grabber. For the first time, Jacob grabs and he holds on to the man. The man's now trying to get away. He says, let me go. My work is now done. I've kept you from running away. Let me go. And Jacob's like, you ain't getting away from here. You've officially kept me from running away. You've made it to where I'm hobbled. So you better bless me. I'm not letting you go till I get something out of this. Can you see this picture?
Still selfish.
Still selfish. And the guy asks him, what's your name? Now, the interesting thing is, Jacob replies, I'm grabber and I've got you. I mean, really, that's what he says, right? My name's Jacob. And the man says, here we are, and this is verse 28. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And that's not a very good translation, because in the Hebrew it says, you will no longer only be called Jacob, but also Israel.
Okay, that's because I'm a little bit ahead of with that, and it flips back and forth between the two names in the next couple chapters.
Yes, from this point forward, he is both. And the Hebrew basically implies that he's not given a new name, but that Israel actually becomes a title. The name Israel has a twofold meaning. It can mean one who is wrestling with God. You know anybody who wrestles with God? They're not for sure they trust God. One minute they do, one minute they don't. One minute they like God, one minute they don't. You know, one who wrestles with God, right? But it can just as accurately mean one in whom God is wrestling. And has God not been wrestling with Jacob his entire life? And so there's a sense in which the name Israel is less of a name and more of a title. The one in whom God is wrestling and the one who is wrestling with God. So in that standpoint, in this moment, are we not all Israel? We're wrestling with God's word. We're trying to figure out what's going on, which is why when you come to the New Testament, Jesus can so easily say, who are my mother and my brothers, but the ones who do the will of my Father? How is it that Paul can talk about us as the new Israel? Because we are the ones who are wrestling with what God is doing. And we are the ones in whom God is wrestling. And so it's as much of a title as it is a name, which is why they're called Jewish by descent, but an Israelite by practice. Not all Jews are Israelites, and not all Israelites are Jews. Do you get what I'm saying? So God's blessing to Jacob is to say, you're no longer just a grasper, but you're the one in whom I'm wrestling. You're the one whom I am working through. And you are the one who's trying to learn what it means to live with me, to wrestle with me. I mean, it's a little bit of a crude metaphor, but for those of you who are, well, everyone in the room right now is in a relationship, at least if not married, and I don't know about, I think everybody online might be, but or you have that. Is it pretty accurate to say a relationship is little more than a wrestling match? I mean, it is, isn't it? There's a wrestling of wills. There's a wrestling of goals. There's a wrestling of aspirations. There's a wrestling of purpose. And the best relationships, you wrestle with things and you come to a mutual conclusion and you go together with it, right? I mean, in the best sense, that's part of it. And is that not the same thing that God has been doing with his people all the way through our story so far? And when you think about that, isn't that what he's done through the entire book? Yes.
So Chris says, so the significance of the story is that God is trying to keep them from running away.
I really do think so. This should not be, we should not call this section Jacob wrestles with God, as much as we should call it God is keeping Jacob from running. God wants something more for Jacob, and Jacob is just doing what Jacob has always done. He's hedging his bets. He's trying to find a plan B. He's trying to make sure that he has a way out, and he's prepared to run if necessary.
So your wives and sons and daughters go across the river, I'm going.
That's a real possibility. I mean, he's ran before. What makes us think he's, I mean, just because you've got, and I'm about to say this and I'm going to regret saying it, but we all know people who have what seem like happy marriages and happy lives, and just for whatever reason, they just throw it all away and they run. We all know somebody like that. And it doesn't make any sense, does it? But we don't always know what they're wrestling with internally. And what this story reminds us is that God has better plans for us, even if we can't see it for ourselves. At least that's what I read in it. Now, they throw on this little bitty piece there in verse 32. Therefore, the Israelites to this day don't eat that muscle around the hip of the, because, you know, God, okay.
Sounds like the superstitious.
A little bit of superstition here, yeah. Just a little bit. But when Jacob's hobbled, can Jacob run?
Maybe it's so more than his brother think pity on it, it's nice, handicap.
Well, let's read ahead. Chapter 33, verses 1 through 3, this next paragraph. Now Jacob looked up and he saw Esau coming. He's been wrestled all night, so his whole plan about maybe getting away is gone. All that time is gone.
See, now he has an excuse for being late, because I was being beat up, I was held back.
So Jacob looked up and he saw Esau coming and the 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 maids. He put the maids with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came to his brother.
Interesting order.
Again, there's that whole notion. He's got his favorite in the back to keep her safe. Any other thoughts?
Well, he did run ahead and meet his brother and he bowed to him.
So, of course, you know, I'm not for sure how much he ran. You know, when your hip's out of socket, you're not running very fast, but he hobbled his way.
7 times, apparently 7 is a significant number.
Well, again, 7 is the number of completeness. It's for the Israelite and Jewish people, 7 is more a complete number than we would say 10 is complete. And of course, that refers back to the 7th day when God rested. But there's also a sense of if he just did it 1 or 2 times, he still could kind of get out of it. After 7 times, you know, he's committed.
My note said bound to the ground 7 times was a sign of respect given to a king. So if he was doing that to Esau, then he was
Another nod to, hey, you know that thing that happened when we were kids? I really didn't mean it, or something. Please don't kill me right now.
And we don't know where Esau's faith is.
We have no clue where Esau's faith is at all. You're right. We don't know if he ended up with Jacob being gone. He learned from his father and worshiped God. We don't know.
Esau did say that he would kill Jacob until Isaac was born, right? Until he died.
I don't remember. In chapter 27, verse 41, he says, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching, and I will kill my brother Jacob." So the moment dad is gone, he's dead.
Did Jacob know that Isaac was still living?
Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know what communication was like between him and his family while he was 20 years in sojourn up there amongst them peoples.
Not that he really trusted
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Chris is going back to the not eating fried meat. They didn't eat any animals' thigh meat. It makes it sound like they were kind of cannibals.
I think I don't know that I'd go that far with it. I mean, they ate sheep and goats and, I mean, we don't have the food laws yet. So realistically, you know, they can eat whatever. But by the same token, I mean, the thigh is one of the biggest muscles in most animals, you know. And today when we eat a chicken, we may think the breast meat is the largest one, but for most animals, I mean, if it's a pig, that's the ham, you know, that's where we get a big chunk. So I think it's probably something a little more along the lines of superstition, because you'd hate to waste meat of any kind, let alone one of the more choice pieces.
Is that the piece they may sacrifice though?
And when we get there, yeah, you're gonna see that that's one of the pieces that is often given as a sacrifice. If it's a celebration sacrifice and everybody's eating the meal together, that piece is what's given to the priests or given over to God. And so that does continue. But beyond that, I'm not for sure. Any other thoughts on the first 3 verses, or keep going? 4 through 11. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor with my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please. If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. Since you have received me with such favor, please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want." So he urged him, and he took it. Well, first of all, one of the things I want to say is, if he ever thought Jacob was a threat, Jacob hobbling up probably caused him to think a little bit different. I mean, if the man can barely walk, he's probably not much of a threat at this point, right?
Or he could have thought, there'd be an easy one to take out.
Or that it'd be an easy one to take out. But in this moment, there is enough of a heart that Esau actually breaks down. Now, I'm not a twin, and I don't really have great relationships with my siblings, so I don't get that warm, fuzzy feeling every time I go home. But we forget these two are twins, and twin relationships are different, are they not? And even when they're bad, they're still tied together. And these two have had a tumultuous relationship, to say the least. Now, the other side of that is, notice, Esau has had dad's stuff all along, right? And Jacob didn't ask for dad's stuff that technically belongs to him, did it? Esau says, "I have more than enough. If you're not laying claim to what I was supposed to have given you as a kid, then we're good." Do you see that?
But Jacob says he has enough too.
And Jacob has learned to say he has enough too. Probably one of the things that is hardest to learn and most valuable to have is contentment. And our culture is definitely not good with that, are we? We are rarely content with what we have.
See, that means you don't need any more.
And he just smirked at that. But in this moment, we have a moment, isn't it? I mean, this is the Hollywood ending, right? You know, they hug each other, they cry, they say everything's fine, we're both good, yay! Right? It probably won't last long, will it?
And then there's an explosion and a cliffhanger.
Don, you're quiet.
It usually is.
But you're pretty pensive back there. You got something, or?
No, not really.
The story from here is somewhat straightforward, but it's still more powerful once we realize that up until God intervening, could you imagine how much different their meeting might have been if Jacob hadn't been humbled? If Jacob had walked up full of himself and hadn't been humbled by God, do you think Esau would have reacted the same way?
Even more on the defensive than receptive.
But the ironic thing is, sometimes it takes being humble to like draw near and.
Yeah, there's the big thing. The reality is we often fail to acknowledge that the setbacks we experience in life, the times when we are humbled, is often what has to happen so that we are prepared to do what God has in store for us. If Jacob hadn't had this man wrestling with him, he might have run away and missed the opportunity to reconcile with his brother. If Jacob had just outright out-wrestled the man and had him be blessed but not been wounded, they might not have reconciled. Sometimes the hardships of life, God allows us to go through so that we're prepared for the next thing. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Keep going. Verse 12. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside God." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the flocks and herds which are nursing are a care to me. And if they are overdriven for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, according to the pace of the cattle that are before me, and according to the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." I wonder if the children looked that frail. Maybe that's another reason why Esau didn't think that they were much of a threat. Any other thoughts or?
The children just could be really young.
We really don't know how old they are. Back a couple chapters when we had the ongoing drama of the four ladies and their children, we don't know how long in between each child that it was before they got pregnant. We don't know what kind of overlap there really is. We don't know how many years it's been since the kids were born that they finally decided to leave. We really don't have an idea of how old they are. But even if they're fairly old, they're apparently not someone that Esau is afraid of. Their stature is not that intimidating.
But it doesn't say how long it took them to travel all that time either. And if they were just kind of camping for a couple of months, I mean, that's gonna wear you down. It's gonna.
So we
You're not
have,
eating right, you're not sleeping right.
from Haran to here, we know we had at least 3 days travel. And then this may be the 4th day. This is back at the top edge of what will become the nation of Israel. They have traveled a good deal, but not as fast as they could if they were all on horseback or something like that. It's not as fast as Jacob could have traveled on his own. It probably took a lot longer to get here than it did to go there. But the other side of that is, and we're going to see, some of these children, again, are not children. They're young adults. I mean, remember back to, whenever we have Abraham sending off Hagar and Ishmael. Ishmael, "Oh, don't let me see this child die." And the child is an 18-year-old strapping young man, This is, and so even though they're called children, I think it's more talking about this as his children, it's not referring to their age. But by the same token, Esau is not seeing anything in these young men that he necessarily deems threatening. I mean,
They're raised to be shepherds and not fighting men. I think they're not gonna be.
well, and remember, Jacob himself was the tent boy. He wasn't out there with the shepherds or with the fighting men like his brother was. So Esau's the jock and Jacob was the nerd, right? And now you've got the kids of the nerd. Well, they might be shepherds, but they're still nerdy shepherds, so they're not the most strapping of young men.
But he's been gone 20 years.
He has been gone 20 years,
He had 7 years before he could have Leah.
correct?
So that's 13 years. And then he has 7 years to get Rachel.
Correct.
So now we're at 14 years, probably.
The oldest of them could be 14, 15, somewhere in there. But by the same token, depending on where we're at in human history, that's getting close to actual manhood on their own, where they could go out on their own. But even at that, it's still pretty clear Esau's not a bit afraid of him.
But when Jacob was protecting his little one, Joseph,
Oh, yeah,
I think of him not being more than 5 or 6. you
at
know,
most,
just
absolutely.
Our own supposition, but he doesn't have a lot of teenagers, it doesn't seem like.
Probably not yet, no. Probably not yet. Any other thoughts or questions about this? Let's read the next paragraph then. 15 to 17. So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of my people who are with me." But he said, "Why should my Lord be so kind to me?" So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the place is called Succoth.
Is there a special meaning for soccer?
It means booths, tents,
It's a barn.
barns.
Probably open sided.
So
They're apart all these years, they meet, hey, how's it going, we go our separate ways.
yeah, I mean, he tells him, "I'm gonna come on down to Seir to see you." But he still takes a detour, builds a house, builds some barns, settles his cattle, and
Is this on Dad's farm?
probably not.
Esau.
Well, that's what. Right.
Probably not even on Esau's land. This is somewhere else. In fact, this area tends to be what would be the northern part of Israel, where even maybe Samaria would be now, or what we think of as Samaria. And Seir is down in what becomes Edom, and that's way down there. So Jacob says he's going to follow by, but he takes a slight detour. And watching my dad build his house by himself, it probably wasn't a very quick detour either. I mean, he did say, "I need to go at the pace of my children and the suckling calves," right? I mean, we just can't rush this thing, Esau. I'll be there, I promise you, but just remember, it's gonna take me a little bit.
You really think Esau's putting a lot of stock in his word anyway?
Well, and notice at first he says, "Okay, well, if you're really in danger, let me leave some of my men." And Jacob's like, no, not necessary. He goes, "Okay, fine, we're getting out of here. We'll take the gifts and we're leaving." They've reconciled. They had their pretty moment. They had, the Hollywood reconciliation. And now, as you said, it's like, oh, blow that thing up and let's move on. Esau goes south, Jacob goes east.
Where is this in compared to Laban's robbery?
So,
They still have the totem thingies.
so they still have the totem thingies. So using that illustration, I had that map and I thought I'd put it out earlier. the journey of Abraham. If you imagine going from Washington DC and up to where Haran is, and I said that's about where Toronto is. So around Toronto, imagine that's where the family's at. That's where Nahor and Laban and Bethuel and Terah, that's where they're at, imagine Toronto. And then whenever Jacob and his family come down, the Mizpah covenant is drawn probably around Detroit. That'd be about the same area. And now you have Jacob going and settling somewhere around Valparaiso, and you have Esau settling down around Lexington. You get the picture? Roughly speaking.
Yeah, a lot of territory.
It's a bigger territory than we think of. It's still a small state, but what is Israel? Modern day Israel is not a very big country. It's about half the size of Indiana, but the region is much bigger than what you think of. And a lot of this region, from the time of the story till now, gets swallowed up by desert. It was not desert back then. It is desert today. If that makes sense. Any other thoughts? Or questions? So let's finish the chapter then. 18. Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the plot of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohai Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. So finally, Jacob says, "You are my God."
But he built this house, rebuilt the house and the lean-tos and everything.
The order here is a little questionable as to what he did first, but
Priorities, man, priorities.
I mean, you got to have a place to live before you. But the interesting thing is, he settles in Shechem. Like I said, if you put this in perspective, that's about somewhere in the West Lafayette, Valparaiso kind of area comparatively. And that's where he decides he's going to land. But the moment he builds a home, the next thing he does is he acknowledges that God is his God. He's not just the God of Abraham. He's not just the God of Isaac. He is the God who has called me Israel. He is the God of Israel and says, I am Israel, he is mine. That's a pretty big turn, isn't it? Now, hopefully, we're not as bullheaded and pig-headed as Jacob is, and that God has to put us through that much of a ringer before we finally relent and say, okay, God, I'm yours, right? But nevertheless, Jacob says, okay, God, I'm done wrestling, I'm yours. That's a pretty good spot to stop in. For as bad as our story has been for the last 33 chapters, Chris, you should be happy. I hope, Chris Carr, you're happy that we get it. Literally, we had Abraham walking with God, but here is Jacob who has finally relented. He's made his mistakes, and now he has turned. He has turned back to God. He is back in the promised land. He is in the promised land with his wives and his children. He's in the promised land. He has a home. He's purchased this plot of land where he's dwelling. He's got flocks. He's got herds. This is, realistically, Abraham bought a plot, but it was a burial plot, wasn't it? Sarah was the first one buried in the land, but Jacob is the first one who actually owns some of the land. And it takes 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, doesn't it? To your point, we got to be patient waiting on God. But the other side of it, let's just be honest. Has the family really been all that willing to follow God?
No, but it takes generations for some of this to set up.
It does take generations to set this up. And the reality is that it is generations where Abraham says yes to walking with God. Isaac maybe becomes the first one to really, be consecrated to God. And Jacob is the first one to really say, no, you are my God. And to a certain degree, that's a little disheartening, but it also should give us some hope. That even if we see one generation falling short, the next generation might be the ones that turn back. And man, that's a message of hope, isn't it? Never count God out.
Do you think we still have hope for Esau?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Esau's people end up becoming the Edomites, and Israelites and Edomites don't really get along all that well, but they're cousins, and we'll see how the relationship goes from here. Final thoughts? Yep.
Chris says, I'm finally happy. It only took 33 chapters.
It only took 33 chapters.
And then Becky says, Chris would like for everyone to remember her in your prayers. She has been not feeling well this last week, and so it's caused some issues with her rehab progress.
We'll definitely be praying for Kristen. Absolutely.
That's all.
Any other final thoughts? You okay with ending a little early?
Yep.
Then let's pray. God, we are grateful that you never give up on us. When we run away, when we make our own plans, when we even make our bad plan B's and C's and D's and E's and F's and all the way down to Z, Lord, you still pursue us. And Lord, you are constantly wrestling with us. Lord, I pray that we would allow you to win. Lord, that we would turn our hearts to you. And Lord, that we would be the ones who say, yes, you are our God. And that the world would see your glory through us. Lord, may it not take 33 chapters of our lives before we finally are willing to relent to you. May you be glorified in us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Bless you all, and the recording is stopped.